All right, but let's go to this HUD stuff. Yesterday, Ben Carson was in front of Congress in the House Oversight. Was this the House Oversight Committee that Ben Carson was in? Quite sure. But it was a HUD hearing. And Ben Carson is up there. And this is following the publishing of a proposal on Friday of last week. Right now, if you are a child and you are an American citizen, you are eligible if you meet the financial requirements for subsidized housing. And your family can join you in that subsidized housing. However, the way that the subsidy is calculated is based upon only those members of your family who are American citizens. So if you are born here in this country, maybe your parents came here on some type of visa. You're born here. You're an American citizen. Their visa expires. They stay here. They're not an American citizen, or their visas have expired, or maybe they came in through the border. It doesn't matter. The policy has been, if you are an American citizen, you cannot afford housing. That housing can be subsidized. However, if it's a 2-bedroom apartment and the price cost, I don't know, $800, let's say, and they will subsidize it prorated based upon how many American citizens are living in that apartment. So they may only give you, there's 4 of you in there, they may only give you $200 if there's only 1 American citizen. But as long as there's 1, they will give you that $200. This new proposal would prohibit families in which at least 1 member is undocumented from obtaining subsidized housing. So it could be that there are 3 of you who live in that apartment who are citizens, and your grandmother you brought in from another country. Or there was 1 child who stayed behind who was not an American citizen, or one mother or the father. HUD is only subsidizing the American citizens in that apartment. But now HUD is apparently going to prevent the entire family from being in there, or not allowing anybody else in there except for an American citizen. HUD assumes that most mixed households will leave the HUD-assisted housing as a result of this rule, according to this analysis by HUD, because of the fear that the family being separated would lead to would lead to people leaving the homes. Now, here's the thing about this. You've got Ben Carson is justifying this by saying it's common sense to just have American citizens in there. But what makes this even worse, Ben Carson's up there calling for 15%, 16% reduction in HUD's budget. This will increase the expense for HUD because now they will subsidize every member of that apartment. It will not decrease the amount of people who are unable to afford decent housing because you're going to put 4 different people in there and you're going to kick 4 other people out. You're going to increase the homelessness amongst children. 55,000 children are anticipated by HUD's own analysis to be impacted by this. 55,000 children. So it does not in any way help the affordable housing crisis that we have in this country. It cuts into HUD's budget, which he wants to shrink anyways, which means that they're going to take the money because they're not going to get new money to deal with this greater expense. They're going to take it away from the upkeep of these places and the upkeep of other housing that HUD sponsors. It's going to cost HUD at least almost $200 million more. Their own analysis says it would exacerbate homelessness. And there's an anticipation that it's going to cost the agency money in rent because families with undocumented immigrants living in there pay their rent more reliably because they are afraid of the scrutiny. Right? This is why undocumenteds are not going en masse to vote in local elections or any elections, because they're afraid. So here is Ben Carson on the Hill. And this guy knows, apparently, we played this yesterday about the Katie Porter exchange, where he didn't know what an REO was, a real estate owned, which is a term about basically when an agency or a bank takes over in a foreclosure because they can't resolve it for the homeowner. Here he is talking to Representative Sylvia Garcia, why HUD is looking to make children of immigrants homeless.
So you're going to shift 55,000 children from being with their families to a homeless status. What's going to happen with these children? Have you thought this program through?
Well, maybe what will happen with them is that you and Congress will do your job and solve the problem.
There you go.
The problem was solved, well, not solved, but slightly mitigated because of, at least theoretically, what HUD is supposed to do.
Well, this has been a policy for 20 years. Over 20
policy
years.
That was the slight dent in the problem. I mean, that's just such immoral sophistry.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, this is all, again, part of a broader program to attack immigrants in this country. And we'll get back to that in a moment, because there's a horrible story about immigrants who are being put in solitary confinement in at least half of the occasions for no reason at all, or really horribly despicable reasons. And this is more of a problem with the agency of ICE than it is necessarily just the Trump administration, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we have more to say about Ben Carson's tenure at HUD and the pathetic nature of it. So yesterday, Ben Carson, and this is also a failure of the media. And I saw a very good tweet about this. Ben Carson, it's not just that he got humiliated by Katie Porter yesterday when he didn't know what a real estate owned, or what that term meant in the context of foreclosure, and the disparity between the number of foreclosures under FHA auspices versus Fannie or Freddie Mae, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, and to make light of it, the fact that Ben Carson thought that real estate owned, that Katie Porter was saying Oreo, he put out a funny tweet, his agency did. Here's a picture of him holding a bag of Oreos to make the joke of like, at the end of the day, and here he is, he's sending a package of Oreos, family size, to Representative Porter. See, I don't have any hard feelings about the fact that I had no idea about what a major component of my agency does.
Talk about the banality of evil.
Yes. Well, what's even more problematic is that he did this got more write-up than the actual issue itself. Because reporters to go in and look at, like, why is it that the FHA is basically executing more foreclosures than Fannie and Freddie? And I think this is on a per capita basis. And Katie Porter made the point after Ben Carson humiliated himself that this is also leading to a lot of urban blight. Because when you have a foreclosed home that is owned by a bank or an agency in this instance, they're not mowing the lawn. They're not keeping vandals out. They're not, when you don't live in a house, even for like a couple of months, things start falling apart on their own. The general upkeep, things like water and HVAC stuff, if these aren't used on a regular basis, it becomes problematic. It's like if you let your car sit for too long, the brakes start to rust out. I mean, this is what houses need to be lived in. And when they're not, they start to fall apart. And when they start to fall apart and you start to get this type of blight, you start to hurt the entire neighborhood.
Yeah,
Not
but
to
then
mention,
real estate speculators can come in and make money on blighted areas.
well, sometimes it's just they sit there and blight.
No, most of the time it's like the girl with tattoos said, it turns into good things for speculators.
But that's actually not the case.
Okay,
there's a
Scout.
lot of times where that blight just exists for years and years and years, and people get trapped in these neighborhoods, and they can't sell their homes because nobody wants to move in to that area because there's so much blight. It breeds crime and obviously other problems, and not to mention the people who get foreclosed upon. They lose their homes. So Ben Carson went on a little bit of a tour on the right to, I guess, in some way, relieve the embarrassment. Who better to rub salve on that embarrassment than Stuart Varney?
Yes, it was. First of all, it was 3.5 hours of testimony. So you can see that some of the networks are only interested in those kinds of sound bites used to ridicule. You know, the fact of the matter is I was having difficulty hearing her.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm very familiar with foreclosed properties and with Oreos, have read extensively about them, knew about them even as a teenager. There was a lot of blighted areas.
Pause it for 1 second. He didn't just say Oreo when she said that. She said, no, REO. Do you know what that stands for? And he said, real estate organizations?
It had been going on for 3 hours, and maybe some of us are human beings and don't spend all of our lives looking at Social Security and Medicare updates. That's called a subtweet.
Or some of us may not even spend our lives digging into any of the literature about the agency that we're running for the U.S. government. Continue.
Detroit, where I grew up. But what is interesting is that, you know, when a family gets into a problem with their mortgage and it's backed by our agency, we go through a lot of procedures with the banks to make sure that they don't get foreclosed upon. In a few cases where they do, obviously we're able to sell those properties very quickly. And the REO portfolio, just over the last 10 years, has dramatically decreased by tenfold. Yeah. You know, 65,000 down to 6,500.
Pause it. What happened 10 years ago? 10 years ago, it was 2009.
There was
We had
statistically
the greatest crash in the value of real estate, perhaps, in the history of the country.
Would you like to know what really happened?
And so the number of foreclosed homes there, obviously. Now, of course, it's dropped 10 years because those homes at one point, they go away. It runs out. The number of foreclosures that are happening there. But the bottom line is the FHA the agency that he oversees as Secretary of HUD is having more foreclosures, continues to have far more foreclosures. She stated to him after that moment, that exchange, that there is a massive study that shows the FHA is responsible in many respects for an enormous amount of blight. He is lying to Stuart Varney.
You know, $65,000 down to $6,500. So I suspect when Katie Porter was an expert in this area, things were very different. That's why I invited her to speak with our staff that deals with these so they can bring her up to date.
Yeah.
Maybe she would then be able to understand what's going on.
I think they were just having a go at you.
Yeah.
But
I think they were just having a go at you.
That's called a haymaker. So I was Katie. What she did was she was at university years ago, and now she doesn't know what she thinks she knows.
Well,
And
one of us doesn't know what's going on. I think I know who it is.
I think we all know who it is. I didn't want to be rude. It was embarrassing to watch her throw these terms around. They're out of date. And now you have this smug guy whose ass is on YouTube just talking all sorts of verbal nonsense. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed because there was a lack of prayer.